Really good to see you this afternoon here in the UK, Dave. And I think it's morning where you are in Virginia.
Likewise, always a pleasure to see you.
We've just had this book published, Reconciling Mission. Um, why don't you start off telling folks why you were interested in co-working on this book with me, Dave?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is I think any time we can do a cross-national comparison, we learn more than if we're focused on a particular context only.
Yes.
And in this case, the fact that you've been working for decades in the UK with congregations, I had been working for decades in the US with congregations, and we were starting to discover similar things in that process, particularly dealing with change and conflict in congregations, and realize there's some mutual learnings that seem to transcend national boundaries that are worth more discussion. And the second thing was I have always enjoyed co-training with you. The 4 or 5 times we did so in the UK and twice in the US, that it's been a pleasure to work with you in that context, and I assumed it would be as well in the writing context, and it was.
No, well, thank you. I've certainly really enjoyed working with you. Let's go back to your response on the first one. So I think one of the things that was striking that kind of I noticed in the research you carried out was a correlation between outward missional engagement and conflict. Do you want to say a word on what you found in your research a few years ago?
Yeah, this goes back to dissertation research more than 20 years ago. But in interviewing pastors and priests who were leading 100 congregations in the American Southwest, I discovered there were two variables that statistically correlated with conflict, meaning they had a positive effect on conflict. They made conflict more likely, is what I mean by positive. And that was if they changed their decision-making structure or if they changed their worship service, both of which can be appropriate but are somewhat disruptive of homeostasis and therefore have a tendency to produce some conflict that can be managed if done well. But out of the nearly 10 changes that I asked about, only one change had a negative effect on conflict, meaning it made conflict slightly less likely. And that was when I asked the question, have you in the last 5 years started any kind of community outreach? And it really didn't matter what it was. It could have ranged from evangelistic outreach to a food distribution program. But if a congregation was outwardly focused, they were slightly less likely to experience internal conflict than congregations that were not.
And I mean, and that makes perfect sense when you think about it, because when we're focused outside and on engaging positively with those outside the church community, we're not, our gaze isn't all dragged to what's going on internally. It's actually, we're looking up, we're looking out, and hopefully we're also looking to how God might be at work in this situation. And that just unlocks things in a very different way to when we're overly focused on what's going on inside the building and inside the church community.
So the way I say it is congregations and other organizations are a lot like individuals. If we're only internally focused, we tend to over-focus on the problems and challenges that we have internally. If we're both internally and externally focused, we can maintain a healthier balance.
Yeah. And for me, one of the things I was really excited about is because I'm aware that there's a number of ways in which kind of more systematic community engagement with local neighborhood and community has been advanced in more exciting ways in North American context than here in the British context. And so when it came to doing some case studies, I knew you would be able to find some case studies that would illustrate things that would be really hard for me to be able to illustrate from case studies in the British context. Not that we haven't got some interesting British
Yeah.
case studies to offer, but been a kind of more of a kind of systematic development of some of that work in the US context. And therefore, some networks and organizations and sort of associations that we just don't have yet at this point in the British context.
Yes, it does seem that there are more parachurch organizations in the US, more faith-based organizations that go beyond local congregation than in the UK. And perhaps some of that has been due to certain structural inducements, tax benefits, and others for
Yeah.
forming nonprofit or charitable organizations here.
Yeah. And my hunch is it's probably also partly that you don't have a state church. And so, particularly in terms of the Church of England, our embeddedness with the state system and the national systems and the kind of historic stuff to do with our buildings and all of that, that kind of has weighed us down in some ways, and not freed us up to do some of the creative stuff that you've been able to do much more of, I think, in the US context.
The marketplace of religious ideas and organizations is quite robust here. It has its own challenges.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, I think there's a question you had for me
Yes.
as a next question.
So, from your perspective in the UK, why would you say that this book matters for congregations today?
So I'm really conscious that there's a sort of prevailing narrative about the decline of mainstream churches in the UK, and that basically there's a fear of death. It's really noticeable within the Church of England, a fear of congregations dying out and of us having to close churches, and a kind of panic about how do we stop this. And it's kind of evidenced by the literally hundreds of millions of pounds that the Church of England has put into trying to revitalize churches one way or another over the last 45 years, I would say, since the decade of evangelism in the 1980s, but with sort of major money being released from what's called the church commissioners to desperately try and turn the ship around. And what is really striking for me about all of that is how fruitless a lot of that has been. Not that there haven't been some good things that have come from it, but it just hasn't turned the ship around. Um, and my sense is that actually there's a whole new mentality, a whole shift in thinking and of finding a way to engage with our local neighborhood and community and to think about God's work and activity in the world that is much more fundamental and that's what's needed. And that's why I think our book is really relevant and exciting because it's going, actually, we can be excited because God has not given up on England. God has not given up on the UK. God is still at work, and God is at work amongst our neighbours. And we just need to wake up and notice that, and think differently, and be more humble, and be prepared to be hosted rather than think we've got to be the hosts. That whole shift is right at the heart of what we're exploring, I think, and that I think is what is needed in our current context. So, what about for you, Dave? What about in the US context? Why is this needed?
So the narrative of church decline lagged a bit behind here in the U.S. what we were hearing from Europe. In fact, there was a time when we thought there was an American exceptionalism that religious organizations were going to continue to be very robust in this context, even though that was not the case in other parts of the Western world. The reality is there was about a generational lag. And so church attendance peaked in the 60s and 70s here in the US, but over the last 50 years, there has been a decline, particularly noticeable in the last 30 years. So the emphasis on revitalization is true in both contexts, with the attractional model often taking lead. So, how do we have compelling worship with contemporary music and vibrant speakers that draw people into our buildings? And that model has its place, but in and of itself, it doesn't seem sufficient to me for the true calling of Christian mission, which is to be in the world, perhaps not fully of it, but to be in the world, and in this case, in our communities and our neighborhoods, to be present there and seeing what God is already doing and how we can connect with that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is really interesting, and that is my sense as well, having lived and worked in the US as well as here in the UK. Is I think your sense of the crisis has come at a later point than we've had here, and so there's been a panic really since the 1960s here about the decline. But the strategies to affect that decline have not really been any different to the ones that has been come up with in a US context. And there have been some interesting voices on the margins who've had some alternative approaches that are some of the things we draw out and refer to in our book, but they haven't largely got the money behind them and the investment behind them that sort of some of the kind of more traditional models have kind of been able to attract.
Yeah, I would say we have a church revitalization industry that doesn't have a counterpoint in the community engagement movement.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, part of that, and this is really interesting, given our sort of Mennonite connections, part of this really does relate to a deeper sense of Christian discipleship and what Christian discipleship looks like, and of the kind of whole life discipleship that we are called to, um, and of how that needs to be part of every Christian's journey, not just those who are got a sort of collar around their neck or have been ordained for particular roles and purposes, but is something that needs to be part of the whole people of God. And so there's a sort of transformation that needs to be affected there, I think, in many traditional church people's kind of thinking and behavior. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that Christian discipleship consists of Christian formation, of someone learning new skills and commitments and values, but also of encountering our neighbors, as Jesus did throughout his ministry, and the call to love neighbor and the broad definition of neighbor that Jesus himself used. So I do think this is at the heart of our Christian calling is not only to be fully present in the church, but to be fully present in our communities.
Yeah. And for me, one of the things that I'm continually struck by reflecting on the Gospels is that Jesus was often the guest, not the host.
True.
And he put himself in an exposed position where he was not in a position of power as the host, he was a guest. And making that shift for our churches, I think, is a really interesting one that our churches need to find a way to embrace, to learn to be hosted by others, to um, allow others to, in a sense, take over our church spaces and offer what they can offer in our church spaces, rather than it being something that we have devised because we think we know better what they need. And that shift, I think, is a really critical one for our churches to make.
Well said. It appears that Jesus never turned down a dinner invitation.
At least not that we know of. So, reflecting on the case studies that you engaged with in the US context and the interviews that you carried out, Dave, and we should maybe say that that's really at the heart of the book is, we conducted sort of in-person interviews in different sort of ch local church situations and with different organizations. But I'm wondering, can you maybe just pick out a couple of highlights for you from those interviews and from the case studies that you explored?
So the first learning I had, and this would not be a surprise, is that every neighborhood, every community is absolutely unique. And so we can't assume that what works beautifully in one neighborhood or community is going to do the same thing across an entire state or country. Uh, in reality, the community in Casa Grande, Arizona, where I visited and had worked previously, primarily Latino, Latina, and Anglo community, compared to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I was interacting primarily with African American and white or Anglo community. And then in Billings, Montana, Native American, Hispanic, Anglo, the communities, the neighborhoods were all quite distinct and unique with unique opportunities and challenges. So that's number one. And the second was the reality that the programs then that emerged in those contexts, the kind of work that the congregations were doing, was a direct response to that unique setting. And so there were no cookie cutter programs. The people didn't say, oh, we saw this happening in such and such community, we thought we had to do it here. There were some examples of that, but that was not the most common. The most common was we were living among our neighbors and hearing them say, this is what we most need in this community, and this is what we responded to.
And I mean, I think in many ways those who are missiologists would say this is kind of like a key insight of the last 25 years is that context is everything. The context matters enormously, and whatever missional engagement looks like, it has to be related to the local context. And I think that's right at the heart of our book is going, actually, you need to listen to and understand your local context if you are to discern what you as a church may be called to within that context.
Right.
And you are not called to do everything. You're not called to change the world. You're called to make a particular vocational contribution in your local context, but in response to who you encounter and what is going on in that locality. Um, and yeah, I think that's a really really vital piece for for our churches to understand.
And back to you. What would you say were a couple of unique insights that you had from case study work?
Well, so one of the things that was really striking for me is that we work with a theoretical framework that I offer, which is derived from a Quaker peacemaker who's been a very significant influence on Mennonite peace builders, Adam Curl. And the distinctive thing I've done is to take Adam Curl's model and apply this to missional engagement in a local context. Um, One of the things in connecting that with the biblical narratives is that you often see that these things are not linear, and often that there are significant detours that happen on the journey. But the detours can be integrated into the story and often can unlock something that, only makes sense later on down the road, where you go, oh, actually, this feels like this was a gift from God, even though at the time it felt like a huge disappointment. So, one example, um, a parish in Lichfield Diocese, where Richard Westwood, who's a graduate of our Reconciling Mission Program and now a trustee of RI, his church had had a vision for trying to do some local youth work. And they partnered with a local Christian youth work organization, and then the whole thing had fallen apart and disintegrated. And they thought, oh no, this has been a disaster. We kind of had this idea, it's come to nothing. But 3 or 4 years down the road, the local authority came to them and said, and another organisation came to them and said, could we use your building to do some youth work and engagement with youth in this local neighbourhood and community? So the initiative didn't come from them, but it connected with where their heart was. Their heart was to reach out and engage with young people in the community. But so they entered into a partnership with another organisation and were interestingly reaching a much broader and more challenging a range of young people in the community. And so going deeper than they were ever able to do with their initial youth work. And so what had looked like a disaster and a kind of detour got transformed, and it sort of sowed the seeds for them to be able to go, actually, we need to pay attention to this. We need to respond to this initiative that's come from outside the church to partner with the local authority and this other organization and to make the most of this asset of our church building, not to keep it to ourselves, but to share it with others. But it was, but it was it was quite a long journey, and it had looked as though it was a detour. And those things that can look like detours often can be a significant clue into something new that is going to emerge, and something that can be kind of deeper and more exciting. So that would be one. Um,
It's like the GPS saying rerouting.
Indeed.
And just
Um,
on that point, if I could add,
yeah.
while the communities and the programs were often quite distinct, the processes were not necessarily distinct. There was a similarity in the kind of processes you would say that people went through from encountering their community to developing programs that was remarkably similar, and that's what emerged from our study that we'll identify.
Yes. Well, and I guess the thing that's interesting and that I was struck me from the US case studies is that as you journey over time and you're faced with the transitions from the initial group of people who are at the heart of developing something, and you're then moving into a next chapter, you've got succession planning having to happen. That there's kind of an interesting journey that happens for what may become something more of a movement or a kind of a network of organizations or an association. Um, and with your background in organizational studies, you'll know there's kind of life cycles to organizations, but there's the potential for renewal and for things entering a new chapter that it can still be life-giving and amazing, but it's different to how it is at the outset.
Yeah. And your second point.
So my second point would be how challenging community building work can be and how costly.
Mm.
So I think this really came through in the Hodge Hill case study in East Birmingham with Al Barrett and his colleagues there. Um, they have been at this work for, I think it must be now getting on for 15 years. They've had some major investment of resources because they've secured some big grants from some of the National Lottery funds and other sources. Um, but when you are working with local people in really economically challenged context, there's an enormous fragility there. And this is not, this is not easy stuff in a context like that. But it's stuff that requires, perseverance and keeping going and a gentleness with oneself and with others that is really, really vital in terms of not running out of steam, I guess. Um, and so, yeah, that costliness of some community building work, particularly in, poorer, more economically challenged neighborhoods, was very striking for me, I think.
And it points to the importance of internal work as well as external work, of finding sabbaticals and other ways to sustain ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's maybe a good segue into the last question I've got, which is in our concluding chapter, we name and identify six threads that we sort of saw running through our case studies. I'm wondering which two you might of those six you might want to highlight for this conversation.
Well, I think I'd start with the first two just because they're so foundational. And in my own experience, doing community work in three different US communities, found them both to be absolutely necessary for sustainable community development. And the first is to be clear about what is our neighborhood, what is our community, to focus on a particular place, as we said it. And for me, that involved moving into those neighborhoods in at least two of the three situations to actually be physically present with my family in a lower income setting. But for a local congregation, to really describe and define this is our community, this is the neighborhood where God has placed us at this time, and let's understand it. Let's take the time to really get to know it. And that leads to the second, which is the importance of forming respectful relationships. And relationship building takes time. And I remember when I had moved to Casa Grande, Arizona, and was talking with the board of Seeds of Hope, the organization there, about plans to develop programs. And I said, I'm going to ask for 6 months with no expectations of program development at all, because what I need to do is build relationships with pastors, priests, other lay people, community leaders in this community, and get to know people. And they said, yes, if you need 6 months to do that, we support it. So that leads to a conversation about patience, which we'll get to. But in reality, I remember the expectation was, well, you're a new executive director, you should be developing programs and raising money. No, actually, developing relationships is the most important first step.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very good. Um, I mean, I think for me, the two I would draw out, and it's maybe I can't remember it's the third one in the chapter, but is to do with the type of leadership that is offered, because leadership is really important. Um, but the type of leadership is really important, and also the sharing of leadership and the drawing in of others to participate in the leadership responsibility. And so Al Barrett, for example, in East Birmingham, for me, embodies some of this type of leadership. But several of the clergy who are on our Reconciling Mission program, it's not, you know, heroic leadership from the front, and I've got the vision and follow me. It's about facilitating and enabling people to discover what they're passionate about for themselves, to release them to actually exercise some leadership and to be empowered to take on some leadership and responsibility for themselves. And, that requires a humility in leadership and a willingness to not be the one who is the one being praised and being, championed, but actually to be praising and championing others. And that leadership is I think a relatively rare thing because it tends not to be what is admired and encouraged and promoted, you know, even in some of our theological colleges, let alone within our kind of wider society. And so the nature of that type of leadership feels really, really critical for the type of shift that we are talking about in the book. And then the second would be what you were just referring to there, is about the importance of patience and of waiting on God and being prepared to wait on God. I was really struck in fact, just yesterday afternoon, we met with a group from Bristol Diocese who are just finishing the Reconciling Mission Program. Um, and one of them, Alison, was talking about something which had crystallized for her 18 months ago on a residential course at the beginning of the program. And it has taken her over a year to kind of get people on board, get local lay leaders and others in the community to grasp something and to go, we've we've got something we think that is emerging here, and then to be able to take action and take it forward. And so, her patience, and her trusting that, waiting for the right moment to see thing actually launch and take off, that is feels a really, really key piece. And not rushing and not thinking, oh, we have got to have had this sorted by whenever because the church is going to die if we don't. No, it's not. And even if it is, God can bring new life out of death.
God seems to be in that business.
Indeed. So, yeah, anything you'd like to offer us, just a closing reflection as we wind up the interview, Dave?
So I was struck by how these themes, and we've just identified four of the six, emerged so naturally from the case studies that we did. But I was glad that we went into the case studies without any assumptions about what the themes would be,
Yeah,
because that allowed them to emerge naturally. And comparing our respective case studies and realizing that even in very different communities, in very different cultural contexts and societies, there are certain key learnings that have emerged that we learned by carefully interviewing people.
yeah. And again, that is at the heart, I think, of what we're saying in terms of process is not thinking you've got the answers beforehand, but being prepared to trust the journey, to engage in the process of listening and attending, and then to draw out from that listening and attending. And that's exactly what we're encouraging church leaders to do in their local churches and to help their key lay people to be on that journey with them, on that kind of exploration and that open-handedness of learning to discover and go, okay, actually, here's what we are called to. Here's what God wants of us in this place at this time. And here's what we can do well and make as a contribution to our community that enables us to be a real blessing to the community and them to be a blessing to us.
Indeed, the mutuality of that exchange.
Yeah. That feels like a great note to end on, Dave.
Thank you, Alistair.